I'm Helen Wright, Senior Impact Manager at the Dixon Poon School of Law, King's College London. Welcome to Research in Action, our new podcast bringing you research from the Dixon Poon School of Law community, which is shaping law, policy and society. Hear conversations with leading experts from King's College London and beyond, as they reveal how their work impacts the world. Our academics aren't just working to address today's most pressing legal challenges, they are driving the debate.
Hello, welcome to Research in Action. In this episode, we'll be talking to Professor Joe Tomlinson, who's Professor of Administrative Law at the Dixon Poon School of Law, King's College London. This episode will focus on research which examines public perceptions of justice in frontline services and perceptions of fairness when dealing with the state. It highlights how frontline services, bureaucratic design and user experience can play a crucial role in shaping trust and access to justice in everyday life. Welcome, Joe, and thank you for doing this.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Maybe the first, as a starting point, this research is conducted over multiple collaborative projects. It's a long-standing programme of research, and it's supported by a wide range of funders. I wondered if it might be useful to start with pulling out some of the main things that you're currently working on and giving a bit of an indication of the wider framework in which the projects sit.
The main idea that we're interested in is in this idea of administrative justice or bureaucratic justice. We tend to use those terms interchangeably. And the basic idea that we're interested in is that every day, millions of people interact with frontline government services. And the way we tend to think about those services in politics and in policy conversations is about the outcomes that people get, what resources get allocated to different services and so on. And we're interested in the processes that people go through when they try to access services and whether they feel like they're just or unjust, and then the effects that those experiences have on their attitudes and behaviors. So, for instance, whether they cooperate with public authorities more or less if they feel like they've had a good or bad process. So we're really interested in unpicking this idea of what justice means in those encounters to members of the public and the effects that they have. We've done several projects over the years on this topic, as you mentioned, but just to give a few examples, we've done a lot of work in the social security space, so looking at benefit systems like universal credit and disability benefits, such as personal independent payment, adult disability payment in Scotland. We're just starting a new 6-year project, which looked at administrative processes and the experience of them in the context of primary care mental health services, so where people have anxiety or depression, the kinds of bureaucracy they encounter.
Who are your collaborators on that project?
That's funded by the Wellbeing Discovery Award that I was lucky to receive recently. So there's a range of collaborators on the project. So we're working with some NHS trusts, and in terms of the academic collaborators on that project, we have people who are mental health specialists, people who are creative artists, people who are quantitative researchers. There's lawyers and social legal researchers like myself involved, and we have an economist joining with us. So it's pretty much, in terms of disciplines, as diverse as you could imagine.
How do frontline services, you touched on this a little bit in the introduction, but how does frontline services like welfare, mental health, so how do they shape people's experience? One of the things you spoke about earlier is they might dictate whether they're more or less cooperative with those systems. I wondered if you could expand on that.
The area where we've done most research is the social security system, which I mentioned earlier. So we examined a range of different outcomes that might result from feeling like you're treated in a just or unjust way in those systems. So if you take universal credit, for most people, universal credit is not just about making a claim for benefits, it's about maintaining that claim over time. So you have to interact with the Department of Work and Pensions on a consistent basis. You'll be doing that at the street level, if you like, in a job centre, but you'll also be doing that at screen level when you're entering things into your UC journal and other forms that you have to fill in. So this constant engagement with the welfare system in the universal credit benefits program, if people feel like they're treated in an unfair way or spoken to in an unfair way or treated in a way that affects their dignity over time, the kind of things we've examined is, what does that reduce their willingness to cooperate, to disclose information to the DWP over time that might be important for the DWP to perform its functions? Well, does it impact on people's mental well-being, their reported mental well-being, and so on? So there are broader variables which we also look at, including trust in government and legitimacy of government. So do people accept government? So these things really matter, we think, because it's not just about people having the right attitudes towards government. It's that when people trust government and people in the benefit system, in this case, trust the benefit system and trust the authorities that they're engaging with, that provides government with more capacity to deliver on the policies that it wants to deliver on. So this is about, in a sense, it's about looking for virtuous circles of process where people feel like they're treated fairly. That builds trust, and then that allows policy to be implemented in a fair but also more effective way.
How do people form those perceptions about whether a system is fair or unfair? And does that differ across social groups?
Yes, it's a really interesting question about how people form perceptions. I could speak for days about this, but I'll give you a shorter answer. So I think first of all, most people when they interact with the service often have repeat interactions. So I gave you one example of the benefit system and universal credit, but that's the case in many services that we engage with. So it's a healthcare service or so on. We often have to go back several times or have an ongoing relationship with the service in some sense. So in many instances, perceptions are formed over time. The other important feature of this is that sometimes we form perceptions vicariously or through other people. And we did a study in my research group on this a few years ago in relation to the Homes for Ukraine scheme. And we studied, for context, the Homes for Ukraine scheme was a scheme where people who were fleeing the war in Ukraine could come to the UK if somebody in the UK essentially had a spare bedroom where that person could stay for a period of time. So the government was trying to mobilize the spare bedrooms in the country. What was quite interesting about that scheme is it gave us an opportunity to interview sponsors, so the people doing the hosting in that scenario. This is a broad generalization, but hopefully it will make the point. Generally speaking, the demographic of people who volunteered were sort of people who were middle class, relatively middle class, had spare bedrooms, and so on. So a certain part of society were volunteering, if you like. And so we interviewed them, and what we noticed is that they were making evaluations of public services that they were helping their guests access that they previously not engaged with before, and they were making fairness evaluations based through the eyes of their guests from Ukraine. What we detected there was a vicarious formation of perception, but they felt that in many cases so strongly that they were reporting it as their just or unjust experience.
Are there any differentials between the way middle class people interact with those systems and processes, or what the perceptions are like across the groups?
It's a question that we've always been interested in, but we've been very careful to engage with. Across all of these studies that we've done, generally speaking, we tend not to see significant differences in perceptions of administrative justice across different demographic groups. So generally, if we look at what are people are defining as fairness in particular or justice in particular contexts, it's relatively static across groups. Now, this isn't what we were expecting to find, but there's almost a sense of universality in a lot of our data. We do have some data sets where that's not the case, and there seems to be slightly different perceptions within different demographics. But what has surprised us so far is the degree to which there is a lot of shared experience in our data. We do have, to give you an example of an area where we have divergence, we've been doing some experimental work where we look at clashes between justice values, as we would call them. So to give you an example, when we ask people what fairness looks like in the benefit system, they will often tell us that they want the system to be consistent, but they also want it to treat people as individuals. Now, at some point, there is a tension between those two things. And so we've done some experimental work where we've asked people who are claiming benefits, essentially, if you would design the system, would you prefer more discretion or more consistency? And what we found is there was a differentiation between demographic groups on those sorts of questions. We don't have good data yet on why that's the case. That just tells us that studies we're going to just highlight that there is a difference there, but we're looking to investigate some of those questions a bit more in the future.
Have you done any work on the way people access services? So, is there any differential between virtual services and in person services?
One of the challenges that we have in doing this research is so many services are digital or hybrid, and we don't have a great evidence base historically looking at exactly the kind of questions that we're looking at. So often when we come to study services, there's already a digital element. So that's something that's usually just assumed within our research. So the short answer is we've not done a huge amount on the differential access pathways, but it is something that we do try to take account of. One of the things that we are particularly interested in is that a lot of services now have a sort of digital by default mode, whereas there's sometimes an exceptional way of operating that's paper-based or more for a more traditional route, and they tend to be less well designed and delivered processes in our experience. So we are interested in investigating further experiences of those kinds of carve-out processes, if you like.
Why do some people avoid applying for the support they're entitled to, do you think?
Yes, it's a really, really good question. There's a huge amount of research on uptake of public services. And broadly, whenever you look at a piece of legislation that gives people a benefit or an entitlement or some kind of mission, you can assume that the whole population that are theoretically entitled are not taking it up. So there's a bunch of reasons that people might not take up that the evidence shows. So for instance, they might feel stigma in a particular context. They might be put off by the prospect of burden or the administered burden of engaging with a system. So there's a whole range of reasons that we see in the literature. One of the things that our research is trying to uncover more is what we call scarring effects, by which we mean if somebody has a negative, unjust experience with a service, are they less likely to go back to that service in the future? But also, if people have routinely unjust or feel like they have routinely unjust interactions, does that make them less willing to engage with other services? So it's really important to remember as sorts of analysts or policy researchers or policy people who spend their time looking at these systems, we tend to carve them up by policy domain. So there's an education system, there's a social security system, there's an immigration system, and so on. Most people that experience government from the ground level, and they sort of see this public sector as more of a whole than we often tend to imagine it. So it's quite possible that somebody has a bad experience in one area, in health, for instance, has another negative experience in social security system, and might be more likely to withdraw or not take up entitlements in the way that it perhaps should.
And how can systems better incorporate that lived experience into their design?
I think there's many ways that systems can better incorporate lived experience into design. In the public sector, there's a huge amount of people trying to make efforts to do that, not everywhere, but in lots of areas, there are huge efforts to do that. The one main reflection I would offer on this is I think it's really important to not just incorporate lived experience and speak to people who are on the receiving end of services, but to ask them the big questions. Because what often happens is, I'll give you an example of this. In central government, there's a huge amount of civil servants who are user designers or user researchers, and their job is to go out and engage with service users and ask them about how they want a particular service designed, maybe a user interface designed, or and so on. How can that be accessible? Those are the sorts of questions that they are interested in. And often the questions, they do really important work, but often the questions that people are being asked are essentially, how do you want this interface laid out? Or, how do you feel about a question phrased in this way? And they're important questions, but they're very small questions. I think it's really important for people doing that work in government, and there's an increasing number of them, to step back and say, well, you look at this whole thing, the way we treat people as a whole, does that feel fair to them? And if not, why not? And in the cases where it's working well, why is that working well? So I think it's really important when these systems try to incorporate lived experience to make sure we're not just asking the micro questions, but also the macro questions about whether these processes are fair.
What does fair treatment mean when people are interacting with services like mental health care or welfare systems? What does it mean to the people who are engaging?
Yeah, so this was one of the questions that motivated us to start this research in the first place. We didn't have a really good conception of what people thought of as fair or just. And I was often in meetings and discussing that people would say, this is what people think is fair. And they would sort of act as a representative of different groups, or people would have their own views or experiences and bring it to those discussions. And what we wanted to add as researchers is to go out and speak to people who use these systems and build from the ground up with no assumptions what things matter. So we often refer to them in our group as process qualities. So if you look at a particular system, does speed matter? Does the way you're spoken to matter or treated with dignity matter? What are the various process qualities that people take into account? And one of the key things that's emerged out of all of our research is it's very contingent on the context. So often what you see in research in the public sector is an attempt to set out universal principles of what fair process is. And our research points out with lots of evidence behind it, points at the finding that the public, when they're thinking about what's just and unjust in particular interactions with public services, it's heavily contingent on the type of interaction that they're having. So to give you an example, even within the benefits system, which is one part of public administration, we found that there are slightly different expectations between disability benefits and universal credit. There's slightly different models of what justice meant that emerged from our research. And so you can imagine as well, and we have some evidence that shows this, when you're complaining compared to when you're lodging an initial claim for something or application for something, your expectations of what's just and not just might shift then as well. One of the big findings we're moving towards is, if we're interested in what the public thinks about interactions, what justice means in a lot of these contexts has overlapping features. Most generally, people want to be spoken to with dignity and so on. But there are particular features that are prominent in people's evaluations in different contexts.
I was thinking while you were talking, actually, we've spoken a lot about the benefits to the user of it being fair, but what are the benefits to the people who are delivering these services of a fairer experience of using them?
Most civil servants that I've engaged with, pretty much all of them, want the systems to be fair. I often think that there's a sense in many services that the interesting thing about many services and the way they're designed is not that they were intended to be unfair processes, but they're experienced as an unfair processes. And I'm really interested in the dissonance between those two things. It's one thing where you can imagine a public authority is rolling out a bad process, and it's a bad process and it's not ideal and so on. But there's lots of areas where government is spending a lot of time trying to get processes right and to make them fair for their users, and still the users don't find them fair. So there's an interesting question in that. So first part of it is, I think government mostly wants to, in my experience, wants to design fair processes for the public. But in terms of the kind of substantive benefits, I would put it like this. Fair process is historically largely been seen as an add-on. So we design the policy, we're going to have this particular benefits policy or this health policy or this education policy, and then we're going to think about implementation. And then part of that implementation approach is fair process. How do we make sure people are treated fairly within it? I would say that's the wrong way of approaching it. Fair process is part of public policy. It's part of what enables you to achieve your ultimate goals. So if you think about the benefits context, the universal credit program, and for many people in that program, requires that people engage, look for work, and so on. That's a controversial part of contemporary welfare policy, but it's part of contemporary welfare policy. So the Department of Work and Pensions defines what it wants to achieve by reference to whether people in the universal credit system who should be looking for work are actively looking for work. And some of our research suggests that people are much more willing to do that when they've been treated fairly. So it's not just about thinking about fair policy as an add-on implementation, but if you treat people fairly, how can that help achieve your policy goals if you're looking at it from that perspective? So there's a principle-based argument for thinking about fair process, but we're trying to develop a lot more evidence for the effects-based argument for thinking about fair process.
What's the relationship between people's experience of these systems? And you spoke of earlier about trust. So, those two things seem to be quite closely linked. And you also talked about trust in one system or an experience in one system having a knock on to the other. So how do those interactions shape perceptions, like how much people trust those processes?
Yeah, so they seem to have a really significant effect on trust. And trust, and the other thing we tend to look at is legitimacy. So do people accept or authority? Do they think authorities making decisions which it seems acceptable? And what we tend to find is those features are, broadly speaking, they mediate other sorts of attitudes and behaviors. So if you have feel like you're being treated fairly, you're more likely to trust, and then that trust then makes you more likely to cooperate, and so on. So in different areas of research, you see these different sorts of pathways, but it's certainly part of a picture.
Going to ask you next about stressful life circumstances and how they change how bureaucracy and justice is experienced. I also started to think while I was reading that question about, are there parts of these systems that take those more stressful circumstances into account within their design? I'm thinking actually about the systems you experience when someone's been bereaved, because they seem to be easier, fairer than some of other experiences.
So I think as a general point, at a very high level, as obviously in terms of process design, there's a level of politics involved. Some areas you see better processes than others where there's been more thought and so on. And in some areas, there are even arguments that the government's deliberately designing unfair processes for particular ends and reasons. And I think that's kind of, to the extent that does exist, and I'm not sort of offering a view on that, but the extent that that exists, I think it's a sort of side thing. Most general public services like operate in a way that's broadly fair.
Is there more care taken in the development of some systems because of stressful life circumstances?
Yeah, so there are also circumstances where you can see that government has tried to consider life experiences. So around bereavement, good example of that. So there are meant to be systems. So there's a system called Tell Us Once, I believe it's
Yes.
called, where you
Yes.
can notify the government of a bereavement, and then it's meant to reduce administrative burden. There are projects going on in governments around the world to recenter or attempt to recenter the design of public services around life events. Many people don't interact with public services all that frequently for life parts of their life. And their interactions with public services are triggered by particular life events, whether that's bereavement, whether it's getting married, whether it's buying your first house, whether those sorts of life events trigger interaction. So there are efforts around the world to sort of build processes around those sorts of ideas. They've not been as developed as they might be at the moment, but you start to see traces of them in UK government. I think there's a lot of potential here, and this has been a conversation in digital government in particular for starting to make services more accessible through one portal and so on. So there are also moves afoot to develop those kinds of services.
And do those services that have been developed in that way, they've got, what can other parts of the system learn from them?
I think it's really important that services learn from good positive examples. And one of the things that you tend to find in the areas that I research, so if I research in social security, mental health, sometimes in education and so on. And often a lot of literature is looking at where these systems fail. And that's a really, really important thing to look at. And lawyers probably have a tendency to look at where things are going wrong more than most researchers, in my experience. There's also an opportunity to learn from those positive examples. And lots of people do have positive experiences with public services and experiences that they think feel as just, and that builds trust and confidence and allows public services to work more efficiently. And I, broadly speaking, don't think we as researchers, not let alone the public sector, don't take enough from those positive examples. The one thing I would say though about learning across context is when you're thinking about what justice means in different frontline interactions, as I mentioned earlier, it's heavily context dependent. One of the things that I constantly see in my data is that the public make sophisticated evaluations about the fairness or unfairness of the processes that they are in. They are not adopting a universal framework to those evaluations. They are conducting much more sophisticated evaluations. So there can be a place for general principles and learning across, but I don't think there's a substitute for the most effective thing, which is really engaging with the users of the service and figuring out what they want from that service and trying to build a service around those ideas.
What types of things do people tend to feel? Can you make any generalizations about the types of things people feel are fair and the types of things people feel are unfair?
Yeah, of course. So there's certain things that recur quite a lot. Things such as dignity, what we would usually conceptualize as dignity. So being spoken to with respect is a really, really important thing. I stress that as an example because a lot of what's happened in government service design in the last 15 or 20 years, particularly with the quite rapid evolution of digital government services, a lot of what's happened has been focused on the idea of getting people what they want as soon as possible, right? And that's important. If you're applying for a benefit, you want to get your decision as soon as possible. You're trying to access study, you want it as soon as possible. But that can, to some extent, undervalue the more relational qualities of a service. So how you're spoken to being an example of that. And when we speak to people who engage with services, that stuff really, really matters. That those kind of relational features, the way you're spoken to, really matter in how you experience the fairness of that process. Even if you get the thing you want out of it, if you've been spoken to rudely or spoken down to, you've had a sense that you've been spoken down to, then that can affect your view on that process. Those kinds of things recur quite a lot. Other things that we see are consistency, neutrality, people from different groups being treated the same. Those sorts of features recur a lot. To give you an example of something that's a bit of a differentiating feature, is to go back to the universal credit and the disability benefits example. We found in relation to disability benefits that the sense that you were being treated in what we call good faith was really important, particularly important in that context. And we suspect that's because when people apply for disability benefits, it's often presented to what we see from the literature, that people feel like they're under suspicion, that they're being evaluated, that they're treated as somebody who might be trying to game the system. And so it came through in our data that what people really wanted, what really mattered as a sort of process quality in that area, is that people were treated as making legitimate claims, that when those claims were approached, they were treated in good faith. And that didn't come up as much in the universal credit research. So those are the sorts of things that sometimes jump out.
Thank you. And last question. Based on your research, what things would you suggest will make the most difference in the way that people? So you talked about dignity, but are there any others that you would add to that? What three things will make the biggest difference?
But I'm going to start off a slightly difficult answer. So first thing is treat their process as policy. Don't see it as a part of implementation. Have it as part of your kind of framing for what policy we want. I think a really good example of that is the benefit system, as we've been talking about. It's moved in a more punitive direction in recent decades. And there's an argument that the same objectives, policy objectives, could be achieved by fairer processes in lots of areas. And so that should be part of the policy consideration and not just part of the implementation. And then in terms of the way you build fair processes, don't accept that there are universal standards that apply across every context. It's really important to really deeply engage with the service users and try to understand what they expect of that particular service. Make sure, this is my third point, make sure that you ask the big questions about fairness and not just the small questions about where the button should be on the screen or how a particular thing should be laid out. The real question that I think is important is at the end of a process, do people feel like they've been treated fairly? And that's lots of small things that can make that happen, but that's also a more generalized evaluation. So it's really important for people designing services to know what matters in that respect.
After saying it was my last question, I've got one more. So, can people still feel like they've been fairly treated even if they haven't got the results that they wanted?
Yes.
Yes.
Is a short answer. And I think the real test of our process is when somebody goes through it and they get what to their mind would be an adverse decision. They don't get what they want and they still feel that that's acceptable. That's the real test, in a sense, of the process. And one of the things that I constantly have debates, particularly with policy officials, about is they also, well, obviously it's about the outcome. So people will think it's an unfair process if they don't get the outcome that they want and so on. And we've got decades and decades of research now that shows the process itself matters independently. People really care about the way they're treated in the process separate to the outcome. And you can build trust and legitimacy through better processes separate. I'm not saying the outcomes don't matter, but it's a distinct way of building trust in government.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to chat today, Joe. It was great. And a thank you to the wonderful comms team from the Dixon Poon School of Law for making these possible. We're developing quite a series of these now, so the links to which will be shared when this podcast goes out. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Ellen.